It began with rising water, a surge of chaos, and a desperate hope that the government designed to protect people would be there when disaster struck. Families fled their homes as floodwaters swallowed towns, leaving behind everything they knew. Parents dialed FEMA call centers praying for answers, for someone to pick up on the other end and guide them through the storm. What happened instead was a silence so staggering it turned into a scandal. Records later showed that on July 7, in the very heart of the crisis, FEMA answered fewer than 16% of calls. Imagine it, out of every 100 cries for help, more than 80 rang unanswered. That number alone could shake public faith in government.
At least of the calls that went to FEMA call centers on July 7th went unanswered.
When the tragedy struck, we knew there would be
a simple yes or no question. They either answered the calls or they didn't answer the calls on July 7th.
When there was a spike in calls, FEMA was there to answer the calls. The majority of the calls were answered at the call centers.
Well, that's not what the report says. The report says that on July 5th, as the floodwaters were starting to recede, FEMA received 3,027 calls from disaster survivors and answered 3,018 of them, which is over 99%. Contractors with 4 call center companies answered the vast majority of the calls. That evening, however, Ms. Noem did not renew the contracts with those 4 companies, and hundreds of contractors were fired, according to the documents and the person briefed on the matter. The next day, July 6th, FEMA received 2,363 calls and answered 846, or roughly 35.8%, according to those documents. And on Monday, July 7th, the agency fielded 16,419 calls and answered 2,613 of them, which is only 15.9%. That's shown by official documents. And FEMA officials were incredibly frustrated by the lapse in those contracts and that it was taking days for Ms. Noem to act. A little while ago, you said that part of your job you felt was to remove, you called them bureaucratic, closing out bureaucratic procedures. To me, having someone, one person only, having to sign off on every contract of $100,000 or more is the definition of bureaucracy. And in this case, it led to thousands of victims not having their calls answered by their government. Their government wasn't there when they reached out for help in their darkest hour. So are those numbers fake? Are you telling me that those are fake numbers, or are they verifiable, and did Ms. Noem misspeak when she said that it was fake news?
What I can tell you is the vast majority of phone calls were answered. There was never a lapse in the contract. Secretary Noem, under her leadership, she's concerned about due diligence and making sure the American people get what they deserve.
So in your mind,
tax dollars.
15.9% of calls being answered is the vast majority? So is that the benchmark now we're looking for FEMA to answer their calls? 15%, or in one case, 35% in a day, in the middle of this disaster, this huge disaster?
I would have to agree with Secretary Noem. That's fake news. The majority of the calls were answered. There was never a lapse in contract.
Well, that is absolutely not what the reports from these companies from the disaster says. They give specific numbers of calls that went unanswered, and I don't see how you can deny these reports, but I will yield my time back.
But what came after revealed something even more disturbing. Governor Kristi Noem, pressed on national television, didn't acknowledge a failure. She didn't admit there were lapses or even that the families who couldn't reach help had been left stranded. Instead, she waved away the entire investigation with 2 words that have become political shields: fake news. According to her, the calls were answered, the staff never left, the contracts were still in place, and FEMA's operation never faltered. To hear her tell it, every flood victim received the support they needed. But internal FEMA records and interviews with officials contradicted her narrative at every turn. The data was unrelenting, the timeline undeniable, and the damage beyond spin. On July 5th, the system worked. Before contracts expired, FEMA call centers handled more than 3,000 calls and answered nearly everyone. It was proof the infrastructure was capable, proof that the system itself wasn't broken. But that same evening, Noem failed to renew contracts with 4 essential call center companies. Hundreds of trained contractors were abruptly dismissed. Overnight, the network went from robust to hollow. The following day, July 6, calls poured in from survivors, over 2,000 of them, and only a third were answered. The very next day, the bottom fell out. More than 16,000 calls hit FEMA lines on July 7, but fewer than 3,000 were picked up. The response rate had collapsed to just 15.9%. That wasn't fake news. That was math written into FEMA's own reports. Behind those numbers was a chorus of outrage from inside the agency itself. Officials who had lived through disaster responses before said they had never seen such an unnecessary breakdown. This wasn't a hurricane toppling power lines or an earthquake destroying infrastructure. It was bureaucracy, slow, rigid, and self-imposed. They called it paralysis. To them it was an avoidable crisis caused not by nature but by the failure of leadership. When the New York Times revealed the story, it struck a nerve, because data doesn't lie. And the interview that followed turned into one of the most searing political takedowns in recent memory. As Noem's defenders tried to brush off the facts, the interviewer zeroed in with the kind of precision that left no room to maneuver. A simple, devastating line of questioning: were the calls answered or not? On July 7, did thousands of people reach silence instead of help? The answer was in the numbers. When Noem's spokesperson insisted the majority of calls were answered, the interviewer dropped the hammer. 15.9% is not a majority. The absurdity of calling that success was laid bare in front of the nation. The deeper problem came from Noem's own policy choices. Long before the flood, she had introduced a rule requiring her personal approval on every FEMA contract over $100,000. In theory, it sounded like accountability, a leader exercising oversight to ensure taxpayer money was spent responsibly. But in practice, during a fast-moving disaster, it was a choke point that strangled the response effort. While families begged for help, while call centers were left short-staffed, critical contracts sat in limbo waiting for one person's signature. It wasn't efficiency. It was obstruction disguised as diligence. And when the waters rose, that obstruction became deadly silence on the other end of the line. Instead of facing this, Noem leaned on a strategy politicians have used again and again: deny, deflect, discredit, label the reporting as fake, paint the critics as biased, and hope the controversy dies before the truth takes hold. But this time the strategy didn't work. The evidence was too clear. Documents showed exactly how many calls were received, exactly how many went unanswered, and exactly when the contracts lapsed. This wasn't rumor or speculation. These were facts carved into FEMA's own daily reports. The cruelty of the situation wasn't just in the statistics. It was in what those missed calls represented. A mother with children trapped upstairs, water climbing each step. An elderly couple watching the flood cut them off from neighbors. Families trying to report loved ones missing, hoping for guidance on where to go, what to do, who could help. Behind every unanswered ring was a story of fear, of desperation, of trust betrayed. And when the government didn't answer, when leadership hid behind excuses, those people were left alone in the dark. That was the moral weight of the scandal. The interview that exposed this wasn't powerful because of theatrics. It was powerful because of clarity. By cutting through the spin, the interviewer reminded viewers of what really matters in leadership: being there when it counts. The moment when 15% was labeled a majority wasn't just absurd, it was symbolic of the disconnect between political rhetoric and lived reality. Families don't care about partisan talking points when they're calling for rescue. They care about whether someone answers. On that day, the government didn't. As the exchange went on, Noem's defense grew thinner. The repetition of fake news no longer sounded like a rebuttal. It sounded like an echo in an empty chamber. Each time the phrase was repeated, the interviewer brought the discussion back to the hard evidence: thousands of missed calls, hundreds of workers let go, contracts that should have been renewed but weren't. Each fact stripped away the shield, leaving behind only the reality of bureaucratic failure. By the end, the image was undeniable: a governor hiding behind slogans while her people suffered in silence. What lingers after the details fade isn't just frustration with one politician. It's the larger question of accountability. Who is government for if not the people it serves? Disasters don't wait for paperwork. Emergencies don't pause until a leader decides to sign a contract. True leadership is about readiness, about clearing roadblocks instead of creating them, about showing up when people need it most. When leaders forget that, when they mistake micromanagement for responsibility, it's not only inefficient, it's dangerous. That's what made this takedown resonate so strongly. It wasn't just a clash between a politician and a reporter, it was a collision between two realities, the polished narrative of control and the brutal evidence of failure. The facts didn't just challenge the spin, they obliterated it. And in the wreckage what remained was a sobering truth. Silence in a time of crisis isn't just a missed call, it's a betrayal. For the families who lived through it, this isn't a debate about fake news or political theater, it's a scar. It's a reminder of the night they dialed for help and found none, and no denial, no spin, no carefully crafted phrase can erase that. So the question now isn't whether the scandal happened. The records are clear. The question is what it says about leadership and the cost of politics played in the middle of disaster. Because when accountability is dodged, when oversight becomes obstruction, when excuses replace responsibility, the people lose. And they don't lose in theory. They lose in the most tangible way possible, the chance to be saved. That is why this moment matters. Not just as a political misstep, not just as another headline in a cycle of scandals, but as a reminder of what leadership should never be. When the waters rose and families cried out, they weren't answered. And that truth echoes louder than any denial could ever hope to drown out. Thanks for watching. If this breakdown helped you see through the noise, make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Share your thoughts in the comments. Was this incompetence or something worse? And if you believe accountability still matters, spread this video, because silence in the halls of power should never mean silence for people in their darkest hour.